Welcome to, for me, a very exciting edition of RU Live. I've been waiting for this ever since Alex Epstein said yes to coming on, which was about a week ago, I guess. Alex was on Unregistered about 2 years ago, and that is, to this day, probably in the top 5 most downloaded episodes for my podcast. And almost every week, someone makes a comment on the YouTube version of it, usually negative about me. Usually fans of Alex, and they feel like I was, I guess, disrespecting you or something. But it's a tremendous interview. But I want to say this: I have been thinking. I loved your book then. I thought it was brilliant then. I think it's even more brilliant now because I keep referring back to it. I keep using the arguments in my own argumentation about climate change and fossil fuels. If you haven't read or heard about The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels by Alex Epstein here, definitely please read it and think about it. I think you would agree with me, it's not climate skepticism or denialism. It's an attempt to reframe the whole question of climate change, right? Is that a fair way to say that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're trying to specify it and trying to integrate it with all the other relevant facts in terms of making the right decisions for human life going forward.
Yeah, but it's an entirely different, you just have a whole different way of, you're offering a different way of thinking about the question of what we should do about climate change, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about that. I don't want to be too vague about it, but yeah, I mean, one way I think about it is you think about it like in the same category of if you're evaluating what to do about antibiotics, you think about side effects, but you have to think about them with a degree of precision, and then you have to integrate them with a precise account of the benefits. And if you just think about the benefits or just think about the side effects, or if you overestimate one or underestimate another, you're going to make bad decisions. And I think with fossil fuels, there's a tendency to only look at side effects and then to catastrophize side effects. So it can be legitimate to say, yes, I believe this has an influence on climate, and even I believe it's a net negative influence, although I think that's harder to establish. But you could still say that and say, well, I believe the benefit is overwhelming. And I think most people don't even put, their thinking isn't in the category of even looking at the full context, as I'd call it, looking at the benefits and the side effects with precision. And so for a lot of people, that's just a new thing, like to think of this with the same logic that we already think of many other decisions.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just such a brilliant intervention. Yeah. So, but Alex, what are you talking about? What positive side effects? Fossil fuels are killing us.
Well, I didn't mean positive side effects.
I was kidding. I was provoked. I was deliberately.
But there are definitely, this is a whole big issue, but one interesting thing about the idea of influencing climate, you think of climate as a global system, unless you have a purely religious view that just this is intrinsically bad for us to influence climate,
right?
There have to be many positive side effects. Just logically, if you're impacting a global climate system, it could be that they're way outweighed by the negatives, but there's a sort of religious idea. I do think it is a religious idea that everything that we dislike in climate must be caused by our impact, and then everything we like is somehow natural, versus saying, you could say more logically, hey, 80% of what this influence causes is stuff that's adverse, and 20% is good. So on balance, on its own, you would prefer not to be adding more CO2 to the atmosphere. That's a kind of coherent thing.
Right.
But then you have to factor in all the energy that you get to use to improve your life when you're adding that CO2 in the atmosphere. And the title of my book implies, I think it's totally worth it when you consider all the energy you get and what you can do with that energy, including all the ways you can make yourself safer from any climate danger with that energy.
Yeah, let's actually broaden the focus for a second here. So what is your critique? Sure. I've heard it many times, but I want you to tell people here. What's your critique of environmentalists and their attitude toward nature?
It's obviously a very philosophical show.
Yes.
It's not a question I usually get on TV. Yeah, and so the question, whenever we're talking about making decisions or evaluating anything, there's always a question that should be explicit, but that's usually implicit, which is what's our standard of evaluation? How are we measuring good and bad? And so if you think about this question, which came up, we had Earth Day recently, like
Mm.
our impact on the Earth. And there's this idea that we've had a bad impact on the Earth. We've been bad humans and we should repent, although we were good this year because we got a deadly virus and stopped doing anything.
That's right.
So we were good this year.
That's
So
right.
Earth has a smiley face on it, or more of one.
That's
I'm
right.
being a little facetious, but in general, it's been bad. And then you look at, well, okay, but is Earth, if we're looking at it from a human perspective and what I call a human flourishing perspective, so our ability to live to our highest potential, which includes things like long life expectancy and health and opportunity for fulfillment, like how does the Earth compare by a human standard now versus 200 years ago before we were using many fossil fuels? Like it's way better.
Right.
And 100 years ago, it's better. It's better than it was 100 years before that. And it keeps getting better. And what you notice if you look at the data are what I call the hydrocarbons and human flourishing hockey sticks. So that's a mouthful, but hydrocarbons just means fossil fuels. It's the technical name. And what you see is, if you go the last 2,000 years, what you see is, like, if you take life expectancy, it's sort of flat at, under 30, and then it just jumps way up in the last 200 years, almost consistently to the present. And then you see, okay, so that's good. And then you see income, and it's the same thing, jumping up.
Mhm.
And then you think, okay, and then you look at something like CO2 emissions, and that's also a hockey stick. And so you see, whoa, there's this crazy thing where there's this correlation between CO2 emissions going up and people living longer lives and having, having many more resources at their disposal. And yet people view it as today's Earth is really bad.
Mhm.
Like, and not just that we've set off something unsustainable that will be bad, but the idea is it is bad. And yet the Earth has never been a better place for human beings to live. So what that implies is when people are saying the Earth is bad, they're using a standard other than human flourishing to evaluate the Earth. And the way to think of it is their standard, you can word it different ways, but one way to word it is unchanged nature. They're evaluating the Earth by how little we've changed it. And so the fact that we have increased our life expectancy and increased our resources, which really means increasing our impact, those two go together, that's a bad thing. And in fact, in the recent movie Planet of the Humans, which was backed by Michael Moore, some of you may have seen it, really interesting movie because it has a lot of criticisms of green energy, which I generally agree with those criticisms. But the director of the movie said, he described as the most horrifying fact he had ever seen, something close to that, was a graph showing that there are 10 times as many humans as there were 100 or 200 years ago, and we have 10 times as many resources per human. And so he viewed this as, this is terrible. Whereas the humans themselves probably viewed this as, oh, this is pretty good because we didn't all die in childbirth and we have all this opportunity. And so that's a perfect illustration of conflicting standards, where the Earth being a great place for human beings to live is viewed as negative because that person is evaluating the Earth by how little human change there has been. And since there's been a lot of human change, they say bad Earth, even though it's good for human beings. So the modern environmental movement, I think the core idea of it is that it puts unchanged nature or an unchanged environment as the highest goal and standard. And so much is being evaluated that way. Although I should say, one of the ways in which that gets put over is, I think there's the idea that, oh, if that's our standard, if we don't change nature, then somehow we're going to preserve a delicate balance and that's going to benefit us in the end. So we could talk about that. But I think ultimately that's a rationalization, because you can't view today's Earth as overall bad compared to the past and not recognize how bad Earth was in the past. If you're on a human standard, you have to say today's Earth, whatever negatives, is an amazing place. And overall, we've done a really good job.
Yeah. So are you saying that the environmentalist movement has been anti-human?
Yes.
Yes. Now, you mean that every member of the Sierra Club, and I used to be a member of the Sierra Club, is anti-human?
No, so it's the idea. I mean, I think you can think of it as what's the core idea of it, but I'd say the more knowledgeable the people involved, the more there tends to be an acknowledgement of the anti-human goal. So I would say once you get to the level, you have certain people saying, we need to dehumanize the planet.
Hmm.
That's pretty clear cut. Like, there are too many people, we need to get rid of them. Although even there's still this rationalization. Well, is it that you want to, quote, get rid of people or lessen the population? Is that because you want human beings to flourish in the future, and we just simply can't flourish, as a matter of fact, if there are 7 billion people? See, then you're sort of on a pro-human standard.
Hmm.
And I think what most people have the idea that we should minimize our impact on nature, because it's a combination of, because we have no right to value ourselves over the rest of nature, but also because if we do value ourselves, it's unsustainable. So that the earth is viewed as this kind of egalitarian place where if we rock the boat, it's going to end up biting us in the ass in the long run. But just what I say, the more knowledgeable you are, the less plausible this is, because the whole of human history of modern industrial history, is us taking a planet that's naturally high in threats and low in resources, and progressively decreasing the threats and increasing the resources through human ingenuity. And the more one actually sees, the more one can see, oh wait, progress is sustainable. And so a progressive human impact on the earth to make it a better place to live, that is sustainable. There's no reason whatsoever to think we can't have a lot more than 7 billion people. And so if you start to see the mechanisms of progress and how they work, and then you still say it's bad, then it's more, you just are anti-human. But I think most people just believe they buy, it's partially they have an anti-human thing, but they don't have that wholly. It's also, they believe that somehow if we act to minimize our impact, then it's going to benefit us in the long run in some vague way.
Now you're talking about human beings who are anti-human. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so how do you explain that? Why are there so many human beings who are anti-human?
It's a really interesting
I mean, I don't have
question.
the answer. I don't know. I mean, it's a really funny thing though, right?
But I think one strong indication of the answer is that it is very common for human beings to be against large other groups of human beings.
True.
So if you take, there are innumerable examples. There are just racist
Sure.
examples where people say, okay, these people who are unlike me in something as superficial as skin color, like, they are bad and we are good. You have more envy-based things where it's, oh, well, the 1% of people, there's a rationalization, oh, I'm mad because they got it unjustly, but clearly there are a lot of 1% people who are just more talented and productive than most of us. And there's an idea, well, I dislike them, and you see a lot of animus then. So if it's possible for human beings to have animus against other human beings, it's not that plausible that they could express a general animus for the direction of the species as a whole. And there's usually a self-exclusion there. It's usually, well, if
Right.
only you are as sustainable as I am, then yeah, you should be one of the living. And I remember when I was in high school, I read this book by P.J. O'Rourke called All the Trouble in the World. And it was one of my first exposures to problems with the modern environmental movement. And he had this chapter, which I never forget the title of, Overpopulation, Just Enough of Me, Way Too Much of You.
Yep.
And so I think that what for certain, and I actually think that there's a huge connection between envy and the modern environmental movement. I think there's a lot of appeal to the idea. And by the way, if anyone hasn't read Atlas Shrugged, I'd recommend you read it just for this purpose. And then Ayn Rand also has an essay called The Age of Envy, which deals with some of this. But in Atlas Shrugged, she couldn't even imagine modern environmentalism. Like, that's worse than what she could imagine. But it was different forms of collectivism and sacrificing individuals, particularly the most productive individuals, for the sake of the supposed collective. And there's a lot of envy analysis there, where people like that idea. They like the idea of socialism in particular. They like the idea that they're better than the people who are clearly better than they are. And I think that if you imagine what the modern environmental movement at the core says is, you are a good person to the extent you do nothing, right? That's what it means to not have an impact. is to do nothing. And so all those people who are successful and smarter and probably happier than you are, and certainly those industrialists making a lot of money, they're actually the bad ones
Mm-hmm.
and you're the good ones. And so to get a halo of virtue, all you have to do is do nothing and then like condemn the trajectory of the human race as unsustainable and immoral in general. Like that's a pretty nice trade for somebody who doesn't feel too good about themselves.
I mean, I'm generally in agreement with the Randian analysis of envy animating a lot of, especially left politics, not just left politics, but mostly left politics, I would say. And I think you might be right on environmentalism too. But I got to think that, first of all, am I right? I am right. Environmentalism as an ideology exists and has existed almost exclusively in the wealthy West, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Um, and even within the wealthy West, it has tended to exist pretty much only among the college educated, meaning the top 1 to 2% of the population, as an ideology, right? I mean, that's where it comes from. That's who talks about this. The vast majority of Americans are not environmentalists, right? Ideologically.
Not ideologically. I mean, I think more and more people believe in you can think of it as the smoke screen of it, that, oh, well, we just want clean air and clean water and we want to make sure we don't screw over the planet for
Yeah.
our grandchildren. But in terms of, people who hold it as a religion or close to a religion, that's interestingly almost exclusively the industrialized world
Right.
and the wealthy college educated people among the industrialized world. And unfortunately, I wish it were true that movements that only arise with the most educated in the most civilized places were good,
Yep.
but they're almost always bad movements.
Tells you something, Mr. Ayn Rand, about the limitations of logic and reason, doesn't it?
That's an interesting, that sounds like a more logical statement than it is, but I appreciate
I think I almost caught you. See?
I appreciate, no, I just admired the kind of structure of it, but no, I mean, what it really tells you, I think, is how the most dangerous thing is smart people with a lot of resources and a bad philosophy. And so there's nothing that, unfortunately, the more wealthy you become, the more the more time you free up for just matters of the mind. That's a great thing in and of itself. But then you also leave open the phenomenon of people coming up with ideas that are very detached from reality and having immense resources to spread them. Versus if you just take environmental ideas, there's no way you can have modern, like an not changing nature, that as an ideal, if you're, say, a tribe in Africa. Like, how could they possibly believe that? They're constantly modifying nature and they would like more power to do it.
Right. So I was getting at that, I think, and this is just speculative. I mean, neither one of us really knows what's inside the heads of these people, and probably they don't either. But I got to think that some of it's self-hatred and guilt for being so wealthy when the rest of the world isn't, because you hear a lot. I mean, the second word out of every environmentalist's mouth is something to do with consumerism, right? It's consumerism is the problem. Greed is the problem. They always point to that. That is a constant refrain, right? And yet they are the wealthiest people on earth, basically, in the history of the world. And they were born into wealth. They were born into a consumer society, and they've been the beneficiaries of it more than anyone else. So I've got to think there's some sort of self-abnegation. That's a nice philosophical academic word. Self-hatred, right? The desire to destroy oneself because one feels guilty about one's own privilege. Is that, again, this is speculative.
Yeah, I wonder about that. There's probably some of that going on, but if you look at how it functions so I've spent a good deal of time at green rallies. So being in this, some semi well-known footage of me in New York City holding up an "I love fossil fuels" sign in the middle of I guess it was 6th Avenue. Yep. And so I've been around to just gotten a feel for movement, like the green movement, not just people who are wearing like a "Make America Green Again" hat, which I just saw at the dog park today when I was walking my dog. Seemed like a nice guy. He didn't know what I did for a living.
I'm sure.
But yeah, if we, but that's, if you see the people for whom it's a source of identity, there might be some kind of I feel guilty, but a lot of it is this gives me a status of superiority. And in general, I look for things where doing something or believing it or acting in some way gives someone a status of superiority. And I find that's a very powerful motivation
Yeah.
for people. I think it's one we should always watch out for in ourselves. And you just think, as I said before, it's very easy to just say, well, I'm against I'm against the civilization. Against our impact on nature. And I'm good. And then you can point out, well, but you're impacting nature all the time, which is part of what this Planet of the Humans points out. And their basic answer has to be, yeah, but I'm working toward it. I need to fly on this, you have to take the most extreme stuff. Like, I need to fly on this private jet so we can ban oil more quickly. That
Right.
kind of
Right.
view. Or the other one will be, and this is equally, I think, ridiculous in the ultimate, but like, I didn't choose this civilization. Like, I didn't decide that we need, and I mean, what does that mean? I mean, you can raise your hand and say, hey, I want to fly on a plane without oil. And guess what? No one knows how to do it. And so then you just fly on a plane with oil. I mean, you're still choosing that. Nobody said you had to fly on a plane. But but you notice that in both cases, people are trying to dissociate themselves from the high impact lifestyle of the civilization. And so I don't know how much there's really internal hand wringing about it. But I definitely see the appeal of, oh, I'm better. I'm like, this makes me a good person because I'm for the environment. And it's such an interesting movement because you really don't have to do anything. You really have to do nothing. I mean, even if you're rich, you just buy a Tesla as your third car, and then you've somehow stopped impacting the planet. I mean, there's these statistics about, at least for a while, the Tesla Model X was people's third car. And the idea is, I'm going to save the planet by paying Elon Musk $100,000, which means all kinds of resources, including energy, to build me a new car. And that's going to make the planet pristine again.
Right.
So it's really like, it's so easy to follow. And that is part of the genius of it.
Yeah. All right. Let me try another curveball, and then I'll call on Drake, who's had his hand raised for a minute here.
Okay.
So I've had as a guest on the show this guy named Christopher Ryan. I don't know if you've heard of him, Sex at Dawn, and he has a new book. I forget. I forget
that was
title.
Recommended to me, but I never read it. So
yeah,
I effectively know nothing.
His new book, I forget the title of it. I think it's called Civilized to Death, but it's an argument against civilization. And
okay,
I had him on my show to talk about it, and I gotta say, even though I came into it like with zero sympathy for that argument, I gotta say he made a pretty important point, which is, in terms of happiness, right? It's kind of hard to argue that the most highly civilized of us on Earth are happier than the less civilized people on Earth. And in fact, these studies are notoriously, weird because it's about something as nebulous as happiness. But I mean, I don't see any really compelling evidence that people who live in New York City or Los Angeles or San Francisco are happier than people who live in the jungle in the Philippines or the Amazon. I mean, does that make sense to you at all? Does that resonate in any way?
It makes sense as an argument. One, it reminds me of a couple of things. One is in one of my favorite Ayn Rand essays, For the New Intellectual. She observes that this is not a direct quote, but it's something like, it is often observed that man's spiritual progress has not kept up with his material progress. And then she says, the solution offered is to renounce material progress.
Right.
And I just love that, like, that's the default, is to blame the material progress.
Yeah.
Versus to say, hey, we at least on average have not been very good, not been as good, at least as good as we can imagine, at figuring out how to think about and enjoy these amazing powers that we have. And you think we're pretty young into these powers in terms of just even being able to do knowledge work for a living. So I think there's a whole science, and including philosophy, but a lot of stuff that's more specific than philosophy, about, okay, how do we actually fully flourish given all of these powers?
Mm-hmm.
I think you see that. I think we can see in our own lives if we think about, okay, what are the places in our own lives where we get a lot of joy and satisfaction? I think most people can point to some really significant ones, at least in pockets. And I think that is a lead. And then you also see some people who overall seem to be enjoying themselves more. And so it's not at all that the material progress determines the spiritual progress. And it can even lead to a lot of, if not handled, if you try to handle it with the same ideas and the same approach, that when you were all living in mud huts and communities of 150 people, then I could see you being worse off. So I think of it as there's a lot of work to do there, but the idea of I want to go back to a primitive way of life, and that's so easy to lionize. I mean, I was just thinking, I don't want to give away any names, but I got to go on a briefly. I was speaking in South Africa a few years ago, and I got to go on a safari briefly. And I just remember one of the guides, who was an amazing guy, he just said kind of casually, "Oh yeah, if someone in our tribe was gay, yeah, they would just get killed." It's like, okay, like, and you might do a happiness study on that tribe and say, yeah, everyone knows their place, and there's not this much. But it's like, oh yeah, you feel a different way, and you just get killed, and there's all this other stuff. So what I would say is, like, the things that I love about my life and about what the society makes possible, including just all of the intellectual stimulation that's possible, which
Mm.
is particularly meaningful to me.
Mm.
Like, I would, even if I was, unhappy 80% of the time, which is not remotely true, like, I would still want that life. Like,
Yeah.
I still want, like, the best of what's possible in an empowered world is just amazing. And I don't think there's anything equivalent
Yeah.
in the unempowered world.
So, but like, okay, great. But like in doing the cost benefit analysis on fossil fuels,
Uh-huh.
what would you say about the person who was born in Pittsburgh in 1920 and
Mm-hmm.
the person who was born in Beijing in 2000, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because after about 10 or so years in those places, they've got asthma because, what the air was like in Pittsburgh in the 1920s and the air was like in Beijing in the aughts.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a fog, low hanging fog. It was so thick, the pollution, the air pollution
Mm-hmm.
from your beloved fossil fuels, Alex. So what would you say about those people?
So, I mean, my beloved fossil fuels then means any conceivable use in any conceivable circumstance, despite the alternative. So the question would be, would, like, for the people involved, I mean, because it's with some of these local things, there is a collective element to the decision making. Like, how did they feel about it? And there's a big difference between a situation where
Mhm.
the national government, say in China, says, hey,
Right.
we're going to put like a high concentration of coal plants with no scrubbers, and we're going to like have open furnaces with coal, and we're doing this against people's will. They're not choosing it. They're not voting for it. Like, that's one thing, which I think that kind of thing is wrong. Versus to say at a given time in Pittsburgh, people say, yeah, this is our industry. We want to be involved in this. Yeah, there are some real health risks and even downsides, but we judge it as best overall. And so we want to, yeah, we could go try to live in the countryside with cleaner air, but we do choose to use dirtier air. I think so. It's that when you're dealing with these kinds of aggregate pollution issues, I think it's very important for local people to have a say in it, because they really have to define, okay, at what threshold and at what circumstances is it too much versus when it isn't enough, or when we need the freedom to do this. And that's one whole issue with how like air quality regulation is thought of, where it's thought of as this national thing that we just decide for everybody. And also just this conceit that, oh, nothing could justify having more emissions in the air. Well, for a lot of people, they choose to go and very eagerly choose to go in cities with air pollution levels that we would consider unacceptable because overall it's beneficial to their lives.
So you're favoring local community control over these questions.
I mean, it depends what you mean by local, but yeah, I mean, in
Yeah.
general, particularly where you have a side effect that has, it's something that it's a shared side effect,
Mm-hmm.
then yeah, I think that the decision, I think you should still think of it in terms of rights, which I talk about a bit, how to do that in the moral case. But yeah, the people deciding basically, okay, at what level does does a level of emissions violate people's rights? I think that needs to be decided based on the full context and the local legislature would have that. You just think even of topographical things like Los Angeles there versus just a totally open place with a lower population. Like you could have in Los Angeles, burning coal with or at least, well, even just say like having a lot of cars, particularly a couple decades ago with, that can really cause a lot of smog. Whereas in a different place, even having dirtier cars would cause very little smog based on the topography. So there are just many, that's another local consideration, but that's one of many that has to be the values of the people in a given location.
That's eminently reasonable, and I would think that should even comport with a lot of left-wing and liberal thinking about this, right? I mean, to talk about community, you're saying that if Pittsburgh, the people of Pittsburgh should have had a right, or you would have defended their right to shut down the steel plants in the 1920s because of what it was doing to the air and the water.
I mean, I think that would have been I would have argued against that as a lot, but it's even shut down the steel plants or do something else. But yeah, I mean, they have to decide like what's the threshold, and I do not think they would have done that in the 1920s.
Okay.
I think they would have said this is there's some overlap actually between this and some of the COVID stuff, but they would have said like this is destroying our livelihood. Like we choose to produce this, and this is an industrial district, an industrial area, an industrial city, and if we understand why not everyone wants to live here, so you can go somewhere else, and then that's fine for you. But if you just have like, see, often what happens is connects to the issue of the wealth of the green movement. It's often, I think, even back in the day, there was this. You take someone like Rousseau, who's an early green movement person. There's this of the wealthier people that you would see some of this "let's not change nature" attitude, but it's something like, yeah, why can't the cities be like my nice countryside home? And it's just evading, well, the city is made possible your nice countryside home, and not everyone can remotely afford that. So you're just saying like, if in a vacuum, you were choosing the air of Pittsburgh in 1920, you'd say that makes no sense. But if you're still in a struggle for survival, and overall this is going to let you live a life where you can survive and live a decent amount and have kids and have a family and have leisure time, you may well choose that versus like a pastoral life on the farm where you're working 16 hours a day and you don't have any modern medicine, for example, and you don't have particularly clean water. So yeah, these are very this kind of thing should definitely be a local kind of decision.
Powerful arguments. They're just totally compelling. I have such a good time talking with you about environmentalism that I forgot that I brought you on to talk about the pandemic.
Yeah. I need to talk about disease.
Which we got to talk about the disease of what everybody's talking about constantly, but we got to do it here because you have a really interesting take on that. But first, let's go to Drake, and then after Drake's question and your answer, we'll go to the private session. Go for it, Drake.
Don't worry, I'm going to tie this question into COVID a bit.
Don't have to.
Oh no, I had one that I wanted to. So you were talking a bit about the politics of envy that led to some of the environmental movement. And I was just wondering how you thought that tied into the way a lot of different movements have almost been looking down on a class of people. Something like eugenics, then the environmental movement, and now COVID, a large part of it does seem to be we have this class of inferiors. Look at those idiots who are getting themselves killed by protesting and not wearing masks, and kind of we need to control them or manage them. That doesn't seem to be a form of envy, unless maybe they're envious that their jobs are more productive than college professors. I'm not sure. Maybe is it a kind of, what do you think motivates that? Is it just someone trying to make themselves feel more intelligent by pushing down someone else?
So let me just make sure I have the examples right. So I get the COVID one of, okay, there's all these people who are going to just be transmitting the disease and spreading it despite my best efforts at staying at home. Well, what was the other example?
Then for climate change, people talking about all of the dumb Americans that don't believe, and how are they so stupid? How do they just deny science? And then even older with like eugenics of, well, we just need to let the stupid people die off and let only smart people remain. That kind of, it seems to be a reoccurring theme with the same elites that push for environmentalism.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't. The eugenics thing is harder for me to connect to. Um, it's a good question. I feel like I'll have a better answer to that when I think about it later. But one thing I have kind of the advantage of being around a lot of, I feel like I can relate very well to liberals and conservatives just because I kind of grew up in a liberal place and know a lot of people who default that way. But I also know a lot of conservatives, and in particular, I know a lot of people in the fossil fuel industry. And so it's really interesting to talk to them. You just take something like, I'll connect this to the others, but you take something like how people view Donald Trump is fascinating to me because it's you can see like both sides, even, and I'm talking about smarter people, like people who would be viewed as smart and successful. Like some people view it as like, how could you possibly vote for Donald Trump under any circumstances? They have a list of things, and it's not a crazy list. It's not like they have no point. And then people say like, how could you not vote for Donald Trump given the alternatives? And what I see in both sides is there's just no ability whatsoever to empathize with the position, intellectually empathize with the position of the other person. So if you're a liberal, let's say, not that only liberals are opposed to reelecting Trump, that's not at all true. But if you're a liberal, like you could at least put yourself in the position of saying, there's a lot of people in this country who really value freedom. And we don't come across as liberals as really valuing freedom very much. And that's a very legitimate interest that they might have. And I think this connects to the COVID issue, where even if you think, yeah, it's not the right thing to protest in close quarters with people, depending on how much social distancing matters when you're outdoors, which I think is quite questionable. Like indoors is a real issue, but like you should at least be able to see, hey, having people valuing their freedom is a very legitimate thing. And even if I don't think their freedom should be decisive, like I can respect that. And I find that people just, there's a tendency among statists in particular to just like totally devalue anyone who wants freedom, to treat it as, oh, they just want the freedom to be irrational. And then this relates to the kind of, oh, they're just going to waste fossil fuels thing. Just treating it as, oh, anyone who buys an SUV, like they're just an irrational person. They have irrational values. They're lower than I am. They're dumb. And it's just, it's such a contempt for other human beings' choices and values. I think one should be very careful to ever just say, oh yeah, the way someone chooses to live their life, that's stupid, that's insane, I would never do that. I mean, you can say, hey, I have better advice, or I think, hey, maybe you shouldn't eat so many Twinkies or something like that. Like you can say that, but even if someone's eating Twinkies, like there's some joy that people gain from Twinkies. And I don't look at someone eating Twinkies and say, oh, that person's an idiot, their life is worthless, my life is so great. So I think that there's definitely like a common denominator among statists of devaluing, not even being able to relate to people's desire for freedom and many of the choices that they make under freedom. And that's what I see with the COVID and the climate stuff. But I think also related to this is the idea that at least a large percentage of humans are fundamentally irrational. And that then leads to a lot of fear. And that partially justifies the statism. So people think, oh, well, if we leave people free, it's just going to be all these people who were shown on spring break saying, if I get the corona, I get, like, that's going to be the entire country. And so we need to lock everybody down, which
Right.
we'll talk about how rational that is
Yeah.
as a policy. But it's just people are so irrational. And the same thing is true for fossil fuels. It's just, oh, if we don't put a stop to this, then everyone's just going to overconsume and the world is going to end. So there is this, and I don't know the exact relationship between the fear of people's irrationality and the total inability to see any rationale in their desire for freedom and their specific choices. But there's something, those are the dynamics I see. But it's a good question. I like getting questions that I don't have a full answer to immediately, but I'll think about that one.
I have a partial answer, which I'll give a little bit later, I think, maybe. But we're going to continue this discussion of Twinkies, spring break, and the pandemic in the private session. So if you are watching this on YouTube and you want to join our sessions at RU Live here. Join Renegade University. Go to renegadeuniversity.com and become a member at any level. And now we're going to go to the private session.